I never cared much about expensive clothes. When I came back from base, all I wanted was something comfortable to face that day. The reading of my grandfather's will brought the whole family together, including my uncle Richard, who always made it his business to remind me that I was the weird sheep among them. To keep listening to this beautiful and special story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special greeting for you in an upcoming story. He looked me up and down and let out a muffled laugh, followed by a comment that seemed rehearsed. Looks like you came to clean the house, not to inherit anything. I pretended not to hear. I sat in silence, as I always did. It wasn't about the money. It never was. The law office smelled like old leather and disappointment. My cousin Sarah sat across from me, adjusting her designer handbag every few minutes. Her husband Mark whispered something in her ear that made her smile. The kind of smile people wear when they think they're about to get very rich. Richard occupied the largest chair in the room, naturally. He'd been talking about grandfather's valuable collections for months, dropping hints about antique furniture and investment accounts like breadcrumbs for anyone willing to listen. I pulled my cardigan closer around my shoulder. It wasn't Tempic, but it was warm, and warmth was all I needed that morning. I'd driven 3 hours from the base just to be here, not because I expected anything, but because it felt right. Grandfather would have wanted me here. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, shuffled through his papers with the slow precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He cleared his throat and began reading the standard legal language that nobody really understands but everyone pretends to follow. Sarah leaned forward. Richard crossed his arms with that satisfied expression he always wore when he thought he was winning something. I watched them all and remembered why I'd chosen the military life. There's something refreshing about being around people who say exactly what they mean, even when it's hard. Here in this room full of relatives, everything felt wrapped in layers of politeness that barely concealed years of resentment and competition. Chapter 2. The moment words cut deep. To my son Richard, Mr. Patterson continued, I leave my collection of books in my desk from the study. Richard's smile faltered slightly. Books weren't exactly the treasure he'd been expecting. To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave my mother's jewelry and the dining room set. Sarah's eyes lit up. She'd been eyeing that jewelry for years. And then the room went quiet as Miss Patterson's eyes found me. To my granddaughter Lauren, I leave the house on Maple Street, along with all its contents and the remainder of my financial assets. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Richard's face went through several expressions before settling on something between confusion and rage. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. I felt my heart racing, but I kept my expression calm. That's what the military teaches you, how to stay steady when everything around you shifts. There must be some mistake, Richard said, his voice tight. The house is worth. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. But we all knew what he meant. The house was worth more than everything else combined. Mr. Patterson adjusted his glasses. There's no mistake, Mr. Whitaker. The will is quite clear. That's when Richard turned to me with that look I'd seen so many times growing up. The look that said I didn't belong, that I was somehow less than the rest of them because I chose a different path. Well, he said, his voice dripping with fake amusement, I guess the house could use a good cleaning anyway. Lauren's dressed for it. The comment hung in the air like smoke. Sarah looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Mark stared at his hands, and I sat there, feeling that familiar sting of being reduced to something small and insignificant in my own family. But I'd learned something in the military about dignity. It's not something anyone can take from you unless you let them, so I looked Richard in the eye and said nothing at all. Chapter 3. Standing in my own silence. The meeting wrapped up with handshakes and forced smiles. Sarah hugged me briefly and whispered, Congratulations, but it felt hollow. Richard shook hands with Mr. Patterson, and muttered something about fairness and family values that made my skin crawl. I stayed behind after everyone left. Mr. Patterson was organizing his papers, and I found myself drawn to the window that overlooked the street. I could see Richard talking animatedly to Sarah by his car, probably already planning some kind of contest to the will. Miss Whitaker? Mr. Patterson's voice was gentle. Are you all right? I turned to face him. Did my grandfather ever mention why he made this decision? The old lawyer smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen all morning. He talked about you quite often actually. He was very proud of your service, your strength, He said you were the only one in the family who never asked him for anything. That was true. While Richard and Sarah had spent years dropping hints about needing money for this or that, visiting grandfather only when they wanted something, I'd simply called him every week from wherever I was stationed. We'd talk about books, about the garden he loved, about nothing important and everything meaningful. He also said, Mr. Patterson continued, that you were the only one who understood the difference between having money and being rich. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what grandfather had meant by that. But sitting in that office, still feeling the sting of Richard's words about my clothes, I began to understand. Rich wasn't about the things you owned or the way you dressed. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be inherited or bought. I thanked Mr. Patterson and walked out into the afternoon sun. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. We need to talk. This doesn't seem right. I deleted the message without responding. Chapter 4. The Weight of What's Unspoken. Driving back to the base, I couldn't stop thinking about grandfather's house. I'd spent so many summers there as a child, before the family dynamics got complicated, before Richard decided I was somehow different and therefore less worthy of respect. The house on Maple Street was where I'd learned to read, sitting in grandfather's lap while he worked through classic novels with infinite patience. It was where I'd first decided I wanted to serve my country, inspired by the photos of my grandfather in his Navy uniform that lined the hallway. It was where I'd felt most like myself before the world started telling me who I should be. Now it was mine, but inheriting something and earning it felt like two different things entirely. My phone rang as I pulled into the base parking lot. It was my friend Jessica, who'd been with me through basic training and 2 deployments. Hey stranger, how did the family thing go? Complicated, I said, which was the simplest way to describe it. Want to talk about it over coffee tomorrow? I'm driving through your area anyway. Jessica had a way of seeing through complicated situations. She'd grown up in a family where love came with conditions too, where success was measured by standards that never quite made sense. Sure, but fair warning. It involves inheritance drama and relatives who think military service is just an extended phase I'm going through. Ah, she said, one of those families. I'll bring extra coffee. That night, lying in my small apartment on base, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything. Part of me felt guilty for inheriting so much when I'd never asked for it. Another part felt angry at Richard for making me feel like I didn't deserve it. And underneath both of those feelings was something else. A quiet certainty that grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. Chapter 5. When the past refuses to stay buried. Jessica arrived the next morning with 2 large coffees and that no-nonsense expression she wore when she was ready to cut through whatever was bothering me. We sat in the small cafe near the base and I told her everything. The will reading, Richard's comment, the look on everyone's faces when they realized I'd inherited the house. So let me get this straight, she said after I finished. Your uncle, who apparently thinks you're not good enough for the family, is upset that your grandfather left you his house. The same grandfather who raised you summers and supported your military career? That's about the size of it. And you feel guilty because I stirred my coffee thinking. Because I never expected it. Because Richard has 2 kids and a mortgage. Because Sarah's been talking about that house for years. Jessica leaned back in her chair. Lauren, do you remember what you told me about your first deployment? About how you learned to trust your instincts even when everyone around you was second-guessing the mission. I nodded. Your grandfather's instincts told him you were the right person for this. Maybe instead of questioning his judgment, you should trust it. That afternoon, I decided to drive to the house. I hadn't been there since grandfather's funeral 6 months ago, and I needed to see it with new eyes, not as the visiting granddaughter but as the owner. The house looked exactly the same. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the porch swing where grandfather and I used to sit and watch thunderstorms roll in. But walking up those front steps with my own key felt surreal. Inside, everything was preserved exactly as grandfather had left it. His coffee cup still sat by his favorite chair. His reading glasses were folded on the table, next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. The house felt like it was waiting for something. I walked through each room slowly, remembering the kitchen where grandfather taught me to make his famous pancakes, the study where he kept his books and his old Navy photos, the guest room where I'd slept during those long summers, dreaming about adventures and courage. In the study I found a letter addressed to me, written in grandfather's careful handwriting. It was dated just 2 months before he died. Chapter 6. The letter that changed everything. My dearest Lauren. The letter began, if you're reading this, it means you've inherited more than you bargained for. And you're probably wondering why. I sat in his old chair and continued reading. I've watched our family for 87 years, and I've learned that there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who expect to be given things, and those who quietly earn everything they receive. You've always been the second kind. Richard is my son, and I love him, but he's spent his life believing that wanting something should be enough to deserve it. Sarah has her mother's generous heart, but she's never learned to stand on her own 2 feet. You, my dear granddaughter, have never asked me for anything except my time and my stories. When you chose military service, Richard said you were running away from the family. I knew better. You were running toward something, toward the person you were meant to become. Every phone call from whatever corner of the world you were stationed in, every letter describing not the dangers you faced, but the friends you'd made and the purpose you'd found, told me I was right about you. The house isn't just a house, Lauren, it's a choice. You can keep it and build something meaningful here, or you can sell it and use the money to build something meaningful somewhere else. But either way, the choice is yours alone. Don't let anyone else's expectations or disappointments make it for you. I know Richard will be upset. I know there will be talk about fairness and family loyalty. But fairness isn't about giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving each person what they can handle, what they've earned, what will help them become their best self. You've already become your best self, Lauren. Now you get to decide what to do with that strength. All my love, grandfather. I read the letter 3 times before the tears came. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone sees you clearly and loves you for exactly who you are. The house suddenly felt different, not like a burden I'd inherited, but like a gift I'd been trusted with. Chapter 7. The day I stopped apologizing. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Richard's talking about contesting the will. Says grandfather wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Can we meet? This time, I didn't delete the message. I responded, coffee shop on Main Street, tomorrow at 2. That evening, I called my commanding officer and requested extended leave. I had decisions to make, and they couldn't be made from a distance. The next afternoon, Sarah showed up looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. She ordered a latte and spent the first 10 minutes talking about her kids, her job, anything except why we were there. Finally I said, Sarah, what did you want to discuss? She sighed. Richard thinks the will isn't fair. He says grandfather was influenced by your military service, that he got some kind of hero worship complex, and wasn't thinking about the whole family. And what do you think? I think, she paused, looking genuinely conflicted. I think grandfather was sharper than any of us right up until the end, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Relief washed over me. At least one family member wasn't going to make this ugly. But Richard's my father, she continued, and he's talking about hiring lawyers. I nodded. That's his choice. You could avoid all this mess, Sarah said quietly. Maybe work out some kind of arrangement. Split things differently. I looked at my cousin. Really looked at her. She was trying to be diplomatic, trying to keep peace in the family. But she was also asking me to give up something that wasn't hers to give up. Something that had been freely given to me by someone who knew me better than anyone. Sarah, I said, do you remember the summer when I was 15, and Richard told me I wasn't really part of the family because I didn't share the same interests as everyone else? She shifted uncomfortably. You know how he gets sometimes. He doesn't mean, he meant it, I said calmly. And yesterday, he looked at my clothes and decided I wasn't dressed appropriately for a family meeting. He's spent 20 years making it clear that I don't belong. Now he wants to fight for inheritance rights because suddenly I'm family again. Sarah stared into her coffee. I'm sorry he said those things. I'm not angry about it anymore, I said, and realized it was true, but I'm not going to apologize for being who I am, or for receiving something I didn't ask for but apparently earned. Chapter 8. Standing in the Truth. Word travels fast in small family. Within a week, Richard had indeed hired a lawyer and filed papers contesting the will. The grounds were undue influence and diminished capacity, legal terms that basically meant he thought grandfather had lost his mind when he decided to leave me the house. Patterson called to inform me of the development. I have to tell you, Miss Whitaker, these cases can get unpleasant. Are you prepared for that? I've been through 2 combat deployments, I said. I think I can handle family drama. It's different when it's family attacking your character, he warned gently. He was right about that. Over the next few weeks I heard through various relatives that Richard was telling people I'd manipulated grandfather, that I'd taken advantage of an old man's loneliness. According to him, I'd deliberately stayed away from family gatherings to make myself seem special, then swooped in during grandfather's final years to secure my inheritance. The accusations stung because they contained just enough truth to sound plausible. I had missed family gatherings, but because Richard made them miserable for me, not because I was playing some long-term game. I had spent more time with grandfather in his final years, but because I genuinely enjoyed his company, not because I was angling for money. Jessica drove down for the weekend and found me sitting on grandfather's porch swing, staring at the legal papers that had been delivered that morning. "You know what I think?" she said, settling beside me. "I think your uncle is scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that your grandfather saw something in you that he never saw in Richard. Scared that at the end of the day, character matters more than just being someone's son." That night we went through grandfather's things together. In his desk drawer, I found a folder labeled Lauren that contained every letter I'd ever sent him, every photo from my deployments, every news clipping about my unit's accomplishment. There was also a notebook where he'd written down things I'd said during our phone calls, observations about leadership, about service, about finding purpose in difficult circumstances. "He was documenting your character," Jessica said, reading over my shoulder. "This isn't the folder of someone who was manipulated. This is the folder of someone who was proud." Chapter 9. The moment everything became clear. The legal battle dragged on for 3 months. During that time, I took a temporary assignment closer to home and lived in grandfather's house. I got to know it as an adult, the way the morning light hit the kitchen table, the sound of rain on the roof, the peaceful quiet of the study where I could read for hours. Richard's lawyer deposed me twice, asking pointed questions about my relationship with grandfather, about when I'd learned about the will, about whether I'd ever discussed inheritance with him. I answered every question honestly, which seemed to frustrate them. There was no smoking gun because there was no conspiracy, just a grandfather who'd loved his granddaughter and made a choice based on that love. The breakthrough came when Mr. Patterson discovered something Richard's legal team had missed. In grandfather's papers there was a folder labeled Family Discussions that contained notes from conversations he'd had with Richard over the year. In these notes, it became clear that Richard had been pressuring grandfather about the inheritance for nearly 5 years, dropping hints about his financial needs, his children's college funds, his plans for the house. In one note, dated 18 months before grandfather died, he'd written, "Richard asked again today about when the time comes. Told him I'm not planning to die anytime soon." He laughed, but it wasn't funny. "I don't think he understands that how you treat people matters more than what you might inherit from them." But the most damaging evidence was a recording. Apparently grandfather had been recording some of his phone conversations in his final year, a habit he'd developed to help him remember details as his memory began to fade. On one recording, Richard could be heard saying, "Dad, Lauren's never around. She doesn't care about family the way Sarah and I do. When you're making decisions about the future, I hope you'll remember who's actually been here." When this recording was played in court, Richard's face went white. His lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear, and I felt a deep sadness for the man who was so focused on what he might inherit that he'd forgotten how to simply love his father. The judge ruled in my favor, but by then, it felt like a hollow victory. Richard left the courthouse without speaking to me. Sarah stopped by that evening to apologize for her father's actions, but the damage to our family relationships felt permanent. Chapter 10. The choice that defined everything. 6 months later, I was sitting in grandfather's study when I made my decision. The house was legally mine, the inheritance was secure, and I could have simply moved on with my life. But I kept thinking about grandfather's letter, about his words regarding fairness and what people could handle. I called Mr. Patterson and asked him to arrange a meeting with Richard and Sarah. They both came, looking suspicious and uncomfortable. We sat in the same office where the will had been read, but this time I was the one with something to say. "I've been thinking about grandfather's definition of fairness," I began, "and I've realized that fighting over his memory isn't what he would have wanted." Richard shifted in his chair but said nothing. The house stays with me, I continued. But I'm establishing a trust fund for Sarah's children's education, funded by a portion of the financial inheritance. And Richard, I'm donating grandfather's book collection to the library in his name. Something I think he would have preferred to having it sit in boxes in your garage. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Lauren, you don't have to. I'm not doing this for you, I said gently. I'm doing it because grandfather taught me that having something isn't the same as deserving it. But deserving something isn't the same as needing it. Richard finally spoke, his voice rough. I owe you an apology. No, I said. You owe grandfather an apology. But since that's not possible anymore, maybe just remember him better than you did in that courtroom. I stood to leave, but turned back one more time. And Richard? The comment about my clothes at the will reading? I was wearing grandfather's favorite cardigan. He gave it to me during my last visit because he said it looked better on me than in his closet. As I walked out of that office for the final time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt or defensive or trying to prove anything. I was simply myself, the granddaughter who'd been loved clearly and chosen carefully by a man who understood the difference between being family and acting like family. The house on Maple Street became my home. I kept grandfather's study exactly as he'd left it, but I made the rest of the space my own. On quiet evenings, I sit in his chair and read his books, and sometimes I can almost hear his voice telling me that the best inheritance isn't what someone leaves you, it's what they teach you about who you want to become. My uniform hangs in the closet now, but I wear the lessons it taught me every day: dignity, service, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth. And when people ask me about family, I tell them the truth, that family isn't about blood or expectations, or who gets what when someone dies. Family is about who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. Everything else is just paperwork.